So today I'm going to be talking about demystifying the data visualization process. I'm just going to put my water down here. And the reason I'm going to be addressing this is, as I was preparing and even trying to think through my topic, I thought, what is something that I actually struggle with? So I thought, if I can kind of address something that's a weakness for me, then I can also benefit from my own preparation. So I thought about data visualization, and that may be kind of somewhat of a surprise that I struggle with that, but where I struggle is that typically what I would do before I prepared this presentation is I would go into the marketing tool, export the data, and because I love playing with data in Excel, I'd bring it into Excel and I'd kind of tool around until I found some kind of visualization that worked, and then I would just call that serendipity. I'd be like, oh wow, this radar chart really works. Serendipity. But it actually wasn't serendipity, it was a lack of planning. And a lack of a strategy. So what I did for this presentation is I pulled together an actual data visualization strategy and framework that you'll be able to take and apply to your data. So I'm going to be focusing exclusively on Google Analytics data for this presentation for a couple reasons. One, if you can visualize Google Analytics data, the rest of marketing data is a walk in the park. Secondly, the naming conventions in Google Analytics, as you'll see, map beautifully to Excel, making it the ideal tutor. Now, my approach may seem a bit Karate Kid-esque. I mean, you may feel like we're kind of like waxing cars and painting fences as we get started, but if you can visualize the interplay between Google Analytics and Excel, you're going to be infinitely more efficient in your data visualization workflow, and it's also going to become less intimidating to you. Now, just to let you know right from the beginning, I'm not going to go into the details of this is how you build this chart, this is what you use this chart for, et cetera, but I did write a monster blog post that will be published on the Moz blog by the end of the presentation, which has tons of resources, all kinds of tips, tricks, ways to trick out your charts, all kinds of links to video tutorials and stuff like that, so I don't leave you unassisted. All right, so first, we're going to talk about Excel. And I'm going to specifically focus on Excel charting, just to bring some scope to this presentation. And there are two components to Excel charts that you need to understand, and those are data series and categories. Categories, you want to think of them as like buckets. And the data series is like the data that goes into the buckets. And I'm telling you, I'm going to break this down into the simplest of terms, so hopefully everyone can grasp this. But let's imagine you take a pile of Legos and you put it in front of a group of kids and you say, okay, I want you to organize these by color into separate bins. And then I want to know how many red Lego bricks are there, how many green, blue, et cetera, et cetera. Those individual bins, those are your categories. Your categories would be red, yellow, blue, white, black, and the data series would be the count of Lego bricks. If you weighed them, then you would have an additional data series that would be the weight of Lego bricks. If you knew the cost, then you would have an additional data series called cost, but you would have the same categories, which would be the colors. Now let's jump into an actual chart. And let's look at the underbelly of Excel charts. And the way you do that is if you right-click on any chart in Excel and choose Select Data, you're going to see this Select Data Source dialog. And what you'll notice here, this one is for the PC, and you see the data series to the left and categories to the right. So going back to our Lego example, if we were charting that, you would see all the colors, red, yellow, blue, green, et cetera, et cetera. The data series would be count, weight, and cost. Here we have analytics data. This is what it looks like on the Mac. Similar to the PC, you have data series on the left, categories on the right, but that's about all these two dialogues have in common. Unfortunately, as with most features in Excel for Mac, the Select Data Source dialog is significantly inferior to that of the Mac in two different ways. One, the sort option is gone. So you'll notice where the arrow is pointing, 2 little triangles. These allow you to sort your data series. This is especially helpful whenever you're building any kind of stacked chart. So like a stacked area chart, stacked column chart, stacked bar chart. What you want to do is order your data series so that you have your big, fat, large data series on the bottom, let's say, of a stacked area chart, with the data series getting incrementally smaller as you go up. That way you have like your least significant data points at the top. And instead of having, which I see a lot with marketing data, where it's like a little tiny data series and then you have a big fat one and then you have 2 tiny ones. And the problem with that is it's much more difficult to interpret. So if I'm charting out mediums and I'm charting out, let's say, revenue, I want to see, whoa, email is at the bottom of that stack and it's huge. It's our cash cow. And that makes it a lot easier to interpret. So, oops. On the Mac, let me back up here. On the Mac, you'll see that it's just gone. There is no sorting option. And if you want to resort your data series on the Mac, you actually have to select the data series, then click Remove, then add it back in by clicking the Add button, and then you have to manually tell Excel, okay, here's the name for the data series, in this case, sessions, here are the values, and here is the category access label. There we go. And which leads us to our second issue of suck, and that is, if you look on the PC, you have one area in that Select Data Source dialog where all of your category access labels are listed. It makes sense because you only have one set of access labels for a single chart. But in the example of our Legos, we have colors. Obviously, they apply to all of the data series. On the Mac, for some strange reason, you have to tell Excel for every data series that you create, oh yeah, the category access labels are still in B2 to B10. It's inefficient and redundant, but as long as you know the inefficiencies and you know how to rock it, you'll be fine. So now when you create a chart, your categories are gonna show up along your axes, and your data series are gonna show up in the legend. Typically, the data series are gonna be values. So going back to our Legos example, again, count, weight, cost. With marketing data, it might be sessions, revenue, e-commerce, conversion rate, ROI, margin, impressions, whatever it is. Those are going to show up in the legend. There are a couple examples where you don't have actual data in the legend, but we'll get to those. Okay, so now let's just let Excel kind of simmer on the back burner for a little bit and turn our attention to Google Analytics. Yes, I'm a child. So Google Analytics also has 2 primary components, just like we saw with Excel, but those are called dimensions and metrics. Dimensions are the far left column in any standard Google Analytics report. Typically, you're only going to see one dimension, but if you want more than one dimension, you can do that a couple of different ways. You can either apply a secondary dimension, which you see an arrow pointing to, or you can create a custom report with a flat table style and get 2 dimensions. That way, I link to a blog post with a video that shows you how to do that, so don't worry. If you want more than 2 dimensions, you need to use the API. If you use the API, you actually get up to 7 dimensions, which is pretty cool. Metrics are all the columns to the right of the dimension. And a good way to think of metrics is if it can be measured with a number, it's a metric, for the most part. Now, there are a few dimensions that actually have numeric values, such as days to transactions or visits to transactions. You'll see 0, 1, 2. But if you bring that data into Excel, it actually comes into Excel as text because it's a dimension, okay? All right, so Remember I said earlier, I'm using Google Analytics because it maps so beautifully to Excel, but if you grasp this, you're going to be able to apply it to any marketing data. Here's the mapping. So dimensions are a lot like buckets in Google Analytics, so they map to categories in your Excel charts. Similarly, metrics map to data series. So if you can just kind of envision when you're in Google Analytics and you're trying to figure out how you're going to chart these, just think, all right, dimensions are going to become my categories, metrics are going to become my data series. There is one time where the dimensions will actually show up in the data series, and I'll show you that. All right, having laid the framework, now we're just going to jump in, and I am going to go through systematically all of your charting options depending on how many dimensions and metrics you choose. So let's start off. Let's say you have 0 dimensions and multiple metrics. I hate to start off on a downer, but you can't do this in the standard UI. So if you go to google.com/analytics, Google Analytics requires you to have at least 1 dimension, but the API doesn't have that restriction. But if you spend enough time in Google Analytics, like I do, you're going to find hacks and workarounds. And I know how marketers are. So many of you, when you hear API, because I was the same way, it was just like, oh, no, that's for propeller heads. So for those of you who are scared of APIs, let's hack some Google Analytics. So the name of the game here is to find a dimension that will just give you 1 bucket. If you can find a dimension in your Google Analytics data that will give you 1 bucket, you're in business. This here is a really popular option for like monthly reports. Let's say you have a dashboard and you just want an overview of the total number of sessions, which used to be called visits, or total goal conversions, total revenue, whatever it is, total impressions. This is the way to get those numbers. This is the only way to get those numbers from the standard Google Analytics. So one option is this user-defined dimension. And what this does, for most of you, if you apply the user-defined dimension, you're only going to get 1 row of data. Going back to the Legos example, it's kind of like saying, all right, put all of the plastic Lego bricks in this bucket. Well, you're only going to have 1 bucket because most of us aren't playing with crystal Legos. So, and that's kind of what we're trying to do here. For most of us, this user-defined dimension is so archaic, they're going to show up as not set. And you don't even care what that not set value is. You can just completely ignore that and scoop up these metrics. In fact, you can create a custom report, which I linked to a blog post and a video that will teach you how to create custom reports in Google Analytics. If that scares you, you can cherry pick the exact metrics that you want and pull them in this way. If for some reason when you apply the user-defined dimension, you have multiple rows, it's time to update your dimension. You really shouldn't be using the user-defined dimension. So if you're using classic Google Analytics, you should really be using custom variables. And if you're using universal, you should be using custom dimensions. So if that happens to you and you don't have 1 row of data, there is another option, and that is to use the year dimension. So you have to create a custom report for this. You're not going to find this in a standard report, but custom reports, all marketers should be working with custom reports. They're awesome. And I really, in my video, I take you by the hand. I'm like, oh, it's not scary. You could do this. I'm like a third base coach. But this works as long as your date range doesn't straddle 2 years. So if you're just doing like a monthly report and you want these overview numbers, this is a good dimension to use. Okay, so now remember I said earlier that in charts, categories and data series are always used together. In this case, we don't have any categories because we only have 1 bucket. We'll only have data series because we only have metrics. So you can't chart this table, chart this data, but you can put it in a table and you can trick it out like I did here last month. Those are just numbers that I brought in, but I tricked it out with some spark lines and some other visualizations that you can do very, very easily. I have tons of blog posts on how to do that. All right, moving on, let's say you have one dimension and one metric. Like let's say you just want to break down total revenue by medium or by country. Just a really simple visualization. You have several options for charts. First is the pie chart. I give you some tips and tricks with the pie chart. It's personally not my favorite option, but if you have a small number of categories, it's better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. All right, next we have the radar chart. I linked to a really cool blog post where you can use this to create like a speedometer chart, also called a gauge chart. Pretty cool. And then we have the column chart. This is like the workhorse chart of Excel. This is what I gravitate to the most. And you have the horizontal bar chart, which is just the column chart flipped on its side. This chart is really good if you have long axis labels. Like let's say you're charting landing pages or campaigns with longer names. This is a really good option. But if you only have one data series like this, I highly recommend that you go with a Spartan chart style. There's no reason to keep all that junk that shows up in Excel, all of your all the default options. Get rid of those. The grid lines, all of that. I linked to a video that I did to the exact minute mark in the video where I show you how to create Spartan charts. And you can just like bring the values right into the bars, fatten them up a little bit. It looks really clean. Another option that I very rarely see with marketing data, but is great used as small multiples, and I include an example in the blog post. This is called the radar chart. It's actually a really cool option if used correctly, but I will warn you, the default formatting is horrific. And it's probably the reason more marketers don't use it, because it looks ugly as hell. But I give you tips on how to clean it up and sexy them up. Next up, this isn't a chart, but you can use a heat map. Last year at MozCon, Avinash, he had a heat map in his slide deck somewhere. It was super sexy. And so I did a blog post, a video tutorial on how to use a heat map. So that's another option that you have. So let's kind of let's take a deeper dive in here. So if you have one dimension, one metric, this is what it's going to look like in a table. We just have medium and sessions. Let's say we create a basic column chart. This is what it's going to look like with a modicum of cleanup. And if I right-click and choose Select Data, here's what the Select Data Source dialog is going to look like. And here's how everything maps out. You'll notice that medium is going to map out to your category axis labels. Sessions are going to populate to the data series, which is then going to populate to your legend. If you only have one data series, please, for the love of all things data, delete it. You don't need a legend with only one data series. Instead, just take that metric, whatever it is, sessions, and put it in your chart title somewhere. You don't need it in the legend. And then your axis labels are going to populate to the axis, as you might imagine. Okay, next up, let's say we have one dimension, multiple metrics that aren't time-based. So in this case, the first option you have here is the clustered column chart. I use this a lot. This is really good to show comparisons. So let's say you want to show sessions versus revenue vis-a-vis. This is a really good option. Next up, we have the stacked column chart. This is a better option if you want to see how each individual data series contributes to the whole. And I give a lot more detail on that in the blog post. I use these a lot. And then these are just their kissing cousins. Same principles, longer labels go with these. And then next up, we have the 100% stacked column chart. These are good if you want to convert your data into percentages and show how everything adds up to 100%. This would be good if you said, all right, I want to see what percentage of each of our social sources are coming from desktop versus tablet versus mobile, something like that. This is called segmentation in analytics geek speak. And next up, same thing, just flipped on its axis. And then we have the radar chart again with just 2 data series. And this is one of my favorite charts. I use them a lot. I link to a blog post. It's a combination chart. This is a really good option if you're charting 2 things that are inherently very different. So sessions versus bounce rate, revenue versus conversion rate, something like that. I really only use it if the second data series is a percentage. I have seen people use 2 whole values. I personally don't recommend it because it gets really dicey to try to interpret. And now let's look under the hood with these. It's going to be just as we saw before. You have the table here. Now we have a clustered column chart. And here's the select data source dialog. And these populate exactly as we saw before. The only difference is that now we have 2 metrics, which become 2 data series, which become 2 items in your legend. The one thing I will say about the legend is don't be afraid to move that around. That's not sacrosanct. And in fact, the positioning that Excel uses for the legend is really subpar. But if you click on the legend and just choose Control-1 or Command-1 if you're on a Mac, you have the option to pop it to the top, bring it down low, whatever you want. But even then, you can just click it, drag it exactly where you want it. You can bring it inside the chart as long as it doesn't cover up any of your columns or bars. And also, if you click on it, you have a bounding box. If it's horizontal and you drag that bounding box in, it's going to stack your legend. And if it's stacked and you drag it out, it's going to make it horizontal. So you actually have quite a few options with that. And I also recommend bumping up the text size. And then just as we saw before. Okay, next up, let's say you have 1 dimension, multiple metrics, except the dimensions now are time-based. So they might be day, month, year, something like that. First up, we have the line chart. Now notice I did not include the line chart in the non-time-based dimensions. The reason for that is that a line chart communicates continuity. So it makes sense to use it for any dimension that's time-based, but it doesn't make sense if your dimensions aren't time-based. There can be exceptions, but they're very, very rare. So for the most part, just think, do I really want these things to connect? You can hack it. Like I have used the line chart with markers, deleted the line, and used that for ranking charts. I believe Richard Baxter, I'm going back a few years, but I believe he has a blog post on how to do that with a pivot chart. Next up, we have the stacked area chart. Now this is really good if you want a stacked option. Now, one thing I will say here is I don't recommend using the stacked line chart ever. The reason is that they're not intuitive to interpret. Just because the lines don't intersect like my lines do in this line chart does not mean that people are going to think that these are contributions to a whole. So I just don't recommend using them. Conversely, I don't recommend using the regular standard area chart. The reason for that is the individual data series end up covering each other, obfuscating your data. I have seen people kind of get around that by dialing up the transparency, but when you dial up the transparency, let's say you have a red data series and a blue data series, you dial up the transparency, when they overlap, now you have a purple data series. Who wants purple data? I don't know, if it's your branding, yeah, that's fine, that's totally cool. It's not cool. No, I'm just kidding. But you don't want to make people stop and think, wait, what is this purple data series? And I saw an example once where the client had a blue data series, a yellow data series, and a green data series. Guess what happened when they dialed up the transparency? We had different versions of green because when the blue and yellow mixed, that made green, which was a different green from the other. So just don't try this at home, kids. All right, next up, we have, just as we saw before, the clustered column chart. one little difference with this is really, really good for showing like year-over-year percent delta. So one way that I use this quite a bit with a time dimension is I'll have months across the horizontal category axis labels, so January, February, March, and then one column will signify, let's say, 2014, and the other data series will signify 2013, and it's a really good way to visually see year-over-year percent delta. You can even add in another column that calculates your percent delta, turn that into a line chart, pop that on a secondary dimension, and then people can easily see, oh wow, we had a 58% increase year over year for whatever this traffic or revenue is. And so you can experiment with that. I've even on occasion put an area chart behind those, and that looks pretty sexy. And then just as we saw before, you have the stacked column and the 100% stacked column. Now notice I don't have any bar charts. The reason for that is I personally don't, and I do have other analysts who have also said the same thing. I don't recommend using horizontal bar charts when working with any kind of dimension that's time-based, because people aren't used to looking up to down when they're progressing through time. We're really used to looking left to right, so I don't recommend using bar charts. All right, next up, let's say you have 2 dimensions and 1 metric. So this is where things start to get a little complicated, and I just want to challenge you to kind of lean in, because if you get this, you will be able to overcome what I've found is the main source of intimidation for marketers. So let's say we have 2 dimensions and 1 metric. First off, if you're going to chart 2 dimensions, you only get 1 metric, so choose wisely. So if we have a dimension for a device category, that's what we're seeing with desktop, mobile, and tablet, which is, by the way, one of my absolute favorite dimensions. I was so happy that Justin Cutroni pimped it yesterday. And then let's say the user type dimension, which they still need to update to user, not visitor. And I just chose these because they both have such limited options, so it made kind of a clean table. And let's say these are sessions. If we create a chart from this, there's no problem. Here we have a clustered column chart. And remember I said earlier that sometimes you will have a dimension show up in your legend. Here is that example. You'll see user type. That's a dimension. That's not a value. That's not a typical data series where we have sessions versus revenue or whatever. So, and then just as we saw before, we have the select data source dialog with the data series populating to the legend, which is ultimately a dimension from Google Analytics. And then you have all the chart options we've seen before that we saw with 1 dimension, multiple metrics. There's just one problem. This data here that I showed you, this is total fantasy data. No marketing tool spits out data exports that look like this. There is actually one, it's my favorite API tool, Analytics Canvas, and you can tweak it and make it spit out data in this format. But this is called report format, and it works beautifully for charting. But this is how marketing data actually shows up in exports. And this is called tabular format. It's very similar to how databases are structured. You'll see each row is called a record. It contains everything that you need to know about that particular data point. And then you have field, and then you have a field name, very much like databases. But if you try to choose 2 of those dimensions and 1 metric, and let's just say you click and drag over them and you try to create a chart, Excel is going to stroke out on you. And I won't ask for a show of hands of how many of you have ever gone to produce a chart that looks like this, because there is no data hall of shame here. I have done it multiple times. And the reason for that is that Excel can't chart out 2 dimensions and 1 metric if they're in that tabular format. So, and it's not just dimensions and metrics from Google Analytics. It's if you have 2 columns or 2 rows. I'm going to stick with columns because that's how most marketing exports come out. If you have 2 columns that have text and 1 column that has values and you try to create a chart from it, this is what it's going to look like. And the reason for that is, like I said, Excel requires your data to be in this format, this report format, where we have 1 dimension across the top, 1 dimension along the rows, and 1 metric with the data. And there is only 1 way to get your data into this format. I know, corny as hell. But, and I know for some of you, you see pivot table and you're like, oh man, we were having such a good time. Why did you bring those up? I know that they're scary and intimidating if you haven't worked with them, but not if you think about what pivot means. So let's just explore that word. So all pivot means is that you're facing one direction and then you just turn another direction. You turn on an axis. That's all that a pivot table is doing. It's taking one of your columns of data that you tell it and you say, okay, go ahead, dedupe this column of data, of dimensions, and put it across the top. And when you do that, your data is going to show up in this report format, which is, and then at this point, you can click any cell inside here and create any chart you want. If you're on a PC, you'll be able to create pivot charts. If you're on a Mac, the redheaded stepchild of Microsoft, you can't create a pivot chart because they're not supported in Mac, but you can create any static chart from a pivot table. So there you go. These are the techniques that you can take and apply as a framework so that when you go into Google Analytics or any other marketing tool, instead of waiting until you bring the data into Excel and tooling around with it, hopefully you can approach data visualization a little more strategically and know what you're going to do to visualize that data before you even crack open Excel. If you want to check out the blog post, you can go to bit.ly/demystify data. I'm telling you, it's a thick and chewy cookie, tons and tons of resources, and I also break it down slide by slide, a full narrative. So, thank you.
Thank you. So this is definitely something where you want to download the deck,
Yeah.
you want to read the blog post, and all the information is there, right?
Exactly.
You started this, when you started learning this stuff, you knew nothing.
Nothing.
Tell us about that process.
Yeah, so I took Annie Cushing's Web Analytics certification course, and in the end, and this was like maybe 6 years ago, and when you're doing your dissertation, he and the other guy, John Marshall, they're like 2 velociraptors coming at you from both sides with like asking you questions and challenging you and stuff. And Avinash said 3 words. I didn't hear anything else he said after that. He just said, if you pass. And the rest of it was like, wah, 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 wah. Because, I mean, I spent $3,500. I was tweeting about this. I couldn't fail publicly just because I didn't know how to visualize data. And so I spent about a week feeling sorry for myself. Honest God, to this day, they send us an email with a breakdown of like feedback and stuff. I just looked at the email to look for a pass or fail. I literally did, a find. And then I just hit archive. I, to this day, have yet to open up that Word doc and read their feedback. But in the process, when I stopped feeling sorry for myself, I was like, okay, I'm going to learn data visualization, and I'm never going to let Excel embarrass me like this again. So I bought Excel books, hand over fist. My daughter Tori is in the audience. She can tell you. I stopped running and started going to a gym so that I could read Excel books while I was working out. People didn't know what to make of me. And then I started watching videos and stuff. And then I thought, okay, how can I translate this for marketers? So it was definitely birthed out of failure.
Yeah, now the stuff you showed today, it's pretty basic stuff. I've seen charts and visualization from you that are way far advanced. Now, for people interested in, like, you go to companies or you do some training, right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little about what your job is. What's your day job?
Okay. Yeah, so I do on-site training for companies if they want to learn more about Google Analytics, data visualization. I was also doing a 3-day dashboard seminar where I teach marketers how to bring data in from Google Analytics, use the Google Analytics API and build out fully dynamic, interactive dashboards, which I'm actually in the process of bringing online. So I'm doing everything in my power to try to get this information out to marketers so that they won't be disappointed or so intimidated and stuff. So
yeah.
That's the deep end of the pool.
Well, Annie, thank you for sharing it with us today, and we hope you come back.
Thank you.
Thanks. Really good.